The
You
thunderstorm
betrayed
came
us
rare and
all!
violent to the Arizona desert, an angry god throwing light and sound against the parched earth. Lightning slashed across the night sky, illuminating a lone figure on the hilltop. For brief electric moments, the man's movements were clear, methodical digging, shoulders hunched against the rain, determination in every thrust of the shovel against the stubborn ground. This was a task meant for darkness, yet the storm betrayed him with its brilliant flashes. The wooden box he'd unearthed lay open now, its contents exposed to the wild sky. Inside, a map drawn on leather, its edges worn smooth by time and handling. Beside it, a comb with a lock of black hair tied with a turquoise strand. The man reached for the map with trembling fingers. 7 years of searching, of rumors and whispers, had led him to this unmarked grave on this forgotten hill. His breath came fast and shallow as lightning etched the landscape again. The gunshot blended with the thunder. At first, the man didn't recognize the sound for what it was, until warmth spread across his chest and his knees buckled beneath him. He fell forward, blood seeping into the leather map, obscuring the careful lines drawn there. His killer emerged from the darkness, a tall figure in a long coat, but it was too late. The blood had already turned the map into an incomprehensible smear of brown and red. "Damn it, Miller," the killer muttered, kneeling beside the body. "You couldn't have just told me where it was?" The storm raged on, indifferent to the death it had witnessed, washing blood into the hungry desert soil. Mason Reed woke with the same dream clinging to him like desert dust. A young Apache woman, blood blossoming across her chest, eyes fixed on his as he worked to save her. The same nightmare that had visited him for 7 years now, as reliable as the sunrise over Salt Valley. He sat up on his narrow bed, rubbing calloused hands over his face. At 40, his body carried the evidence of his past, surgical scars on his hands from years as an army doctor, and deeper, invisible wounds from what he'd witnessed. The blue eyes that looked back at him from his shaving mirror seemed to belong to someone else, someone who hadn't yet seen what he had seen. Outside, the Arizona morning was already turning hostile with heat. Mason's small ranch sat on the edge of Salt Valley, a modest homestead that somehow managed to maintain a steady water supply despite the drought that had strangled the region for 3 years now. The wooden fence posts leaned at tired angles, and the few cattle he kept were thin but alive, which was more than most ranchers in the area could claim. Every morning followed the same ritual. Mason would check his property boundaries, not to chase away trespassers, but searching for something specific, signs that they had returned. The small footprints near the spring, the whisper of movement along the ridge. Today was no different as he saddled his horse, a sturdy paint mare that had carried him through many such mornings. As he rode, his gaze drifted toward Black Mountain, a dark silhouette against the eastern sky, the site of the massacre 7 years ago, the place where everything changed. Mason had been the regiment doctor, not a soldier. He had protested the attack, arguing there was no evidence of the Apache raiders Major Blackwood claimed were hiding there. But orders were orders, and Mason had been there when the cavalry rode into the peaceful settlement at dawn. He had been there when the shooting started, and he had been there when a young Apache woman with fierce eyes had fallen, a bullet in her chest. In the chaos, he dragged her behind a rock outcropping and worked frantically to save her. "Don't make a sound," he'd whispered in broken Apache, words learned from a guide during his early army days. She had stared at him with equal parts fear and defiance, even as he dug the bullet from her flesh and stitched the wound. What happened after that, he couldn't say for certain. The firing had stopped, the screaming faded. When he returned to the main force, Blackwood assumed he'd been tending to one of their own men. Mason never corrected him, and he never knew if the woman had survived or died alone in the desert. Now, as he approached the spring that bubbled up from beneath a cluster of rocks on his property, Mason noticed something that made his heart quicken. Small footprints in the mud, fresh from the morning's visit, and caught on a thorny bush nearby, a small piece of cloth with distinct embroidery. Apache handiwork, no question. He crouched down, examining the footprints carefully. A woman, or perhaps an older child. The imprints were shallow, indicating someone moving carefully, aware of leaving traces. Mason's hand instinctively reached for the pistol at his hip, but stopped halfway. These weren't the tracks of raiders or thieves. These were the tracks of the desperate. The sound of approaching horses made him straighten quickly. He recognized the riders immediately. Clayton Blackwood, now a retired major and one of the largest landowners in the territory, accompanied by two hard-faced men Mason didn't know. "Reed," Blackwood called out, reining his black stallion to a stop. The years hadn't softened the man's features. If anything, prosperity had made him sharper, more entitled. His gray-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes expensive, despite the dust covering them. "Blackwood," Mason acknowledged with a slight nod. "Been a while." "Not by choice," the former major replied, eyes scanning the area. "Been busy expanding my holdings while you've been, whatever it is you do, out here alone." One of Blackwood's companions snickered, but Mason kept his expression neutral. "What brings you to my property?" Blackwood dismounted, his boots landing heavily in the dirt. "Thought you should know, there's a group of Apache runaways moving through the area. Broke out of the reservation down south." He gestured vaguely. "Been stealing cattle, water, making trouble." "Haven't seen any trouble," Mason said evenly. "You wouldn't, would you?" Blackwood stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Always were soft on them. Remember Black Mountain, Reed? Remember how your uncertainties nearly compromised the mission?" Mason's jaw tightened. "I remember Black Mountain differently than you do, I suspect." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. Just a friendly warning between old comrades. "You see any sign of these savages, you ride for town immediately. We all have duties to our kind." The implication hung in the air between them. Blackwood mounted his horse again, giving Mason a last measuring look. Mason hung the charm from a nail near his window, where it caught the late afternoon light. It was his most closely guarded secret, a capital offense in the eyes of men like Blackwood. Fraternizing with the enemy, but Mason had stopped seeing enemies and allies long ago. Now he just saw people, desperate to survive in a land that showed no mercy. As night fell, he sat on his porch, watching the darkness gather over the valley. The dream still lingered at the edges of his mind, the woman's eyes, the blood on his hands, and the question that had haunted him for 7 years. Did she live? Elena Ramirez moved like a shadow among the rocks, her dark eyes scanning the valley below. From this vantage point on the ridge, she could see the small ranch with its steady trickle of water flowing from the spring, the place they had been visiting in secret for nearly 2 weeks now. At 35, Elena carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived what should have killed her. A long scar traced the line of her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her simple dress. Her Apache mother had given her the high cheekbones and midnight hair, while her Mexican father had contributed the slightly lighter skin and the name she now rarely used. To her small group of survivors, she was simply Kia T, she who leads. 5 people depended on her decisions: 2 women, a teenage boy, and 2 children. The remnants of different Apache bands who had found each other at the reservation, united by a shared determination to reclaim their freedom. They had escaped during a supply delivery 3 months ago, moving north through territories they once called home, now parceled out to white settlers with fences and boundaries. Elena had been watching the man who owned this ranch. She recognized him, though she doubted he would recognize her. 7 years and a lifetime of suffering had changed them both. But she knew those hands, surgeon's hands that had once dug a bullet from her chest and sewn her flesh back together, while gunfire and screams surrounded them. She couldn't be certain if he was an ally, or if his kindness had been a momentary aberration. Men changed, allegiances shifted, but so far he had shown no inclination to drive them away, though she was certain he had noticed their visits to his spring. "Kia T," came a soft voice behind her. Naya, a woman in her 20s, approached carefully. "Sarah is asking for you." Elena nodded and followed Naya back to their small camp, hidden within a cluster of large boulders. The fire was kept small, more for cooking than warmth in the desert night. Around it sat the others: Tarak, the 16-year-old boy whose silence spoke of traumas Elena could only guess at; Lena, an older woman who had lost 2 sons to a government school and never smiled anymore; and the children, Kai, a boy of 10, and Sarah, the youngest at 8. Sarah was different from the others. Her eyes were a startling green, and though she understood the Apache language, she spoke only English. Her delicate features hinted at her mixed heritage, though Elena never spoke of it openly. The girl wore a silver cross around her neck, a relic from her mother that she refused to remove even when it might have been safer to hide it. "You went to watch again," Sarah said as Elena sat beside her. Not a question, but a statement. Elena nodded. "We need to know if it's safe." "The man with the sad eyes," Sarah said quietly. "He won't hurt us." Elena studied the child carefully. Sarah often knew things she shouldn't, saw things others missed. It was both a gift and a burden. "How can you be sure?" Sarah touched the cross at her neck. "Mother would have trusted him." Elena didn't argue, though doubt lingered. Sarah's mother, Rebecca Walker, had been a missionary who lived among them, teaching English and tending to the sick alongside Elena's own mother. Rebecca had fallen in love with a tribal warrior, bringing both joy and complications to the community. But that was before Black Mountain, before everything was lost. "We need to find the water map," Elena said, changing the subject. "It's our only hope for the others at the reservation." The water map was their true purpose, an ancient document showing the way to a network of caves with underground springs, enough water to sustain a small tribe through any drought. It had been lost during the massacre, and Elena believed a cavalry soldier had taken it. Their search had led them here, to the shadow of Black Mountain, where everything had ended and where, perhaps, a new beginning waited. "We will find it," Sarah said with the simple certainty of a child. "But first we need his help." She pointed down toward the ranch. Elena sighed. Trust didn't come easily anymore, especially trust in a white man who had once worn a cavalry uniform. But water was running out, and Blackwood's men were closing in. Soon they might have no choice. Sheriff Ezekiel Daniels arrived at Mason's ranch the following afternoon. He was new to the territory, having replaced the previous sheriff who had died under mysterious circumstances 6 months earlier. Daniels was tall and weathered, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Despite claiming to be in his early 60s, he moved with the precision of a much younger man. "Dr. Reed," he called out as Mason stepped onto his porch. "Thought I'd introduce myself properly. Been meaning to make the rounds to all the outlying properties." Mason wiped his hands on a rag, studying the newcomer carefully. "Just Mason is fine. Haven't been a doctor in some time." Daniels dismounted, removing his hat to reveal a shock of white hair. "Once a doctor, always a doctor, I'd say, especially out here where medical help is scarce." He extended a hand. "Sheriff Ezekiel Daniels." Mason shook it, noting the calluses that spoke of a life holding weapons rather than law books. "What brings you all the way out here, Sheriff? I doubt it's a social call." Daniels smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Perceptive. I'm investigating reports of water theft in the area. Tensions are high with this drought, and I'd like to prevent any unnecessary violence." "Haven't had any trouble with water thieves," Mason replied. "Good to hear." Daniels glanced around the property with an assessing gaze. "I must say your spring seems remarkably resilient compared to others I've seen. Any idea why that might be?" Mason shrugged. "Underground sources are unpredictable. Just fortunate, I suppose." "Indeed." Daniels reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "There's another matter. Body was found up on Black Mountain 3 days ago. White man, been dead a while. Had this on him, or what's left of it." Mason unfolded the paper to find a crude drawing of what appeared to be a map, heavily stained with what could only be blood. Most of the details were obscured, but a few symbols remained visible along the edges, symbols that looked distinctly Apache. "Any idea who he was?" Mason asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Name was Frank Miller, according to papers that we found. Former cavalry, like yourself." Daniels watched Mason's face carefully. "Served in this region about 7 years back." Mason handed the paper back, his pulse quickening. "Don't recall the name." "No? Strange. He was part of the Black Mountain operation. I'd have thought all you boys would know each other." The casual mention of the massacre sent a chill through Mason. "How would you know about Black Mountain, Sheriff? You said you were new to these parts." Daniel's smile thinned. "I do my research, Doctor. Important to understand the history of the place you're meant to keep peaceful." He returned the bloodied map to his pocket. "They say when a man dies with secrets, his spirit never truly rests. You believe that?" "Can't say I've given it much thought." Well, Daniels replaced his hat. If you happen to recall anything about Miller or notice anything unusual around your property, you know where to find me. Mason watched the sheriff ride away, the unease from earlier now solidified into something darker. Daniels knew too much, asked too many specific questions, and that map, bloody and indecipherable as it was, looked too similar to the rumors he had heard years ago about an Apache treasure map supposedly lost during the massacre. As twilight descended, Mason took out his old harmonica and sat on the porch steps. The melancholy tune he played wasn't from any songbook he'd ever owned. It was an Apache melody he'd learned from a guide during his early Army days. The notes hung in the still desert air, carrying farther than words could. In the fading light, he could see fresh footprints near his well. Small impressions he pretended not to notice. Deliberately, he left a plate of beans and cornbread on the porch table before going inside. An invitation of sorts to whoever was watching from the shadows. He slept fitfully that night, the dream more vivid than usual. The Apache woman's face clearer, her eyes fixed on his as he worked to save her. But this time in the dream, she spoke to him. "You found me once. Find me again." Mason woke with a start, moonlight streaming through his window. For a moment, he thought the sound that had roused him was part of the dream. A soft shuffling, barely perceptible. Then he heard it again. Someone was in his house. Moving silently, he reached for the pistol he kept beside his bed, then paused at the sound of a child's breathing. Cautious now, he lit the small lamp on his bedside table. A girl stood in his doorway, no more than 8 or 9 years old, thin but not starving, with striking green eyes that regarded him without fear. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache garments and what looked like a repurposed cotton dress. Around her neck hung a silver cross that caught the lamplight. "She needs help," the girl said in perfect, unaccented English. "She said you wouldn't shoot us." Mason lowered his gun immediately. "Who needs help?" "Kia T, she's hurt." The girl gestured urgently. "Please, they were chasing us." Without hesitation, Mason grabbed his medical bag, maintained out of habit rather than regular use, and followed the child outside. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. The girl led him toward the edge of his property, where the land began to rise toward the ridge. In the shadow of a large boulder, a woman lay on the ground, her breathing labored. Even in the dim starlight, Mason could see the blood soaking through the fabric wrapped around her thigh. "Gunshot?" he asked, kneeling beside her. The woman's eyes flew open at the sound of his voice. Dark, fierce eyes that Mason recognized immediately. The same ones that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. The same ones that had stared up at him as he dug a bullet from her chest during the massacre. "You," she whispered in Apache. "Me," he responded in the same language, his pronunciation clumsy but understandable. "Let me help, again." As he unwrapped the makeshift bandage, his fingers brushed against an old scar on her chest, his handiwork from 7 years ago. Their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition, years of questions answered in a single glance. "I didn't know if you survived," he said softly. "I didn't know if I could trust the memory," she replied. Behind them, the girl watched with solemn eyes, clutching her silver cross as the past and present collided in the Arizona moonlight. The bullet had grazed Elena's thigh. As Mason tended to the wound, his hands moved with the same steady precision that had once saved her life, a skill unchanged by the 7 years that had passed between them. "Blackwood's men?" he asked, not looking up from his task. Elena nodded. "They were patrolling near the ridge. We almost made it past them, but—" She winced as he tightened the bandage. "Sarah ran ahead. I had to draw their attention away." "Sarah," Mason glanced at the girl who sat nearby, watching them intently. "That's your name?" The child nodded. "Are you going to help us hide?" The question hung between them, weighted with implication. Mason finished securing the bandage before answering. "It's not safe for you to move tonight," he said finally. "You can stay in my barn until morning." "The others," Elena began. "Others?" Mason's expression tightened. "My people. 4 more, hiding in the rocks above your land." He considered this information, calculating risks and options. "Can they stay hidden until tomorrow night?" Elena nodded. "Yes, Naya knows what to do if I don't return." "Then tomorrow night I'll help you move them somewhere safer." He began packing up his medical supplies. "For now, you and Sarah come with me." The barn was clean and dry, with fresh hay in the loft. Mason brought blankets, water, and more food than they could eat in one night. As he arranged these items, Elena watched him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" she asked when Sarah had dozed off on a makeshift bed of hay. Mason paused, considering his answer. 7 years ago, I failed to stop something terrible. I couldn't save your people then." He met her gaze directly. "Maybe I can help now." "You saved me," Elena said quietly. "Did I?" His voice held a bitter edge. "I patched a bullet hole and left you alone in the desert. I survived." She touched the scar on her neck, not from a bullet, but from something that came after. Many didn't. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history between them. Finally, Mason spoke again. "You called yourself Kia T, but the girl called you something else?" "Elena." She rarely used the name anymore. "Elena Ramirez. My father was Mexican. My mother Apache. I belong nowhere and everywhere." A sad smile crossed her face. "Now I just belong to those who depend on me." Mason nodded, understanding the burden of responsibility. "Get some rest. I'll check on you before dawn." As he turned to leave, Elena called after him. "The charm you have hanging in your window. It was my mother's. I thought I lost it that day." Mason froze, caught between shame and relief. "I found it after. Went back looking for survivors." He didn't add that he'd kept it as a reminder, a penance, a connection to a debt unpaid. "I'll return it to you." "No," Elena said. "Keep it. Perhaps it protected you all these years, as it once protected her." Mason nodded once and left, closing the barn door quietly behind him. Inside his cabin, he stared at the Apache charm, seeing it now through new eyes. Not just a relic of his guilt, but a living connection to people who had survived against all odds. People now depending on him. He didn't sleep again that night. Dawn brought a clarity to the desert that washed away shadows and secrets. Mason tended to his few animals, keeping up normal appearances, while his mind raced with plans and contingencies. Elena remained hidden in the barn, her wound painful but clean, while Sarah ventured out cautiously to help Mason with small chores. The girl was a puzzle, clearly half white, with her green eyes and facility with English, yet fully integrated into Apache life. She worked alongside Mason with quiet efficiency, showing none of the fear or hesitation he might have expected. "You speak English very well," he remarked as they collected eggs from his small henhouse. "Mother taught me," Sarah replied, carefully placing an egg in her basket. She said words are bridges between worlds. "Your mother sounds wise." Sarah nodded solemnly. "She went to the stars before I could remember her face. But Elena says I have her eyes." Mason hesitated, then asked, "Was your mother Apache?" "No." Sarah touched the silver cross at her neck. "She was a teacher who came to help. Elena says she loved our people enough to become one of us." Before Mason could ask more, dust on the horizon signaled approaching riders. He quickly ushered Sarah into the barn with Elena and went to meet the visitors. Blackwood again, but this time with 4 men instead of 2. Their expressions told Mason everything he needed to know. This wasn't a social call. "Reed," Blackwood called out, his tone falsely jovial. "Thought I'd check in, see if you'd noticed any disturbances since our last chat." Mason stood his ground as the men dismounted, forming a loose semicircle around him. "Nothing to report, Blackwood. Just another hot day in paradise." One of Blackwood's men spat in the dirt. "Funny thing, Doc, we was tracking some Apache prints last night. Trail led right toward your property before we lost it." "Lot of tracks out here," Mason replied evenly. "Coyotes, deer, prospectors passing through." These weren't animal tracks. Blackwood stepped closer, invading Mason's space. "And we found blood on the rocks. Someone was hit." "Sorry to hear that. Hope your aim improves." The comment earned him a sharp look from Blackwood. "Always with the smart remarks, Reed. That's why you never fit in with the regiment, Ed." He glanced around the property. "Mind if we have a look around, just to be thorough?" Mason's hand drifted toward his hip, where his pistol would normally be holstered, but he'd left it inside. A deliberate choice. He didn't want to escalate this into a shooting match he couldn't win. "Actually, I do mind. This is private property, Blackwood. Unless you've suddenly become a lawman, you have no right to search anything. Blackwood's expression hardened. We're trying to protect our community from savages, Reed. Savages who'd cut your throat in your sleep and take everything you've worked for. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Or maybe you're harboring sympathies I should know about. My sympathies are with the rule of law, Mason replied, not backing down. You want to search my property? Come back with the sheriff and a proper warrant. For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwood might order his men to search anyway. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I will. In fact, I've hired professional Indian hunters to track down these runaways. Men who won't be distracted by misplaced conscience. Mason kept his expression neutral despite the chill that ran through him. Indian hunters were notorious for their brutality and for not distinguishing between hostile warriors and women and children. You do what you think is right, Blackwood, Mason said, and I'll do the same. Blackwood mounted his horse, looking down at Mason with contempt. I'll be back, Reed, with the law or without it. And if I find out you're hiding anything, or anyone, you'll regret it. He turned to his men. Let's ride. Mason watched them leave, then immediately went to the barn. Elena was already preparing to move, her face set in grim determination. You heard, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. We need to go, tonight. Blackwood's hired Indian hunters, Mason warned. Professional trackers. They'll find your people if they're still on that ridge. Elena closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new threat. Then we need a different place. Somewhere they won't look. Mason considered his options. His property wasn't large, but it included a section of rocky terrain with several small caves, places he'd explored when he first settled here. Not comfortable, but defensible and hidden from casual observation. I know somewhere, he said, but first, I need to know everything. Why are you really here, Elena? What are you looking for? Elena hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who had fallen asleep on the hay. Not what, who? She met Mason's gaze directly. The man who took the water map. The what? During the massacre, one of your soldiers took an ancient document from our shaman's body. A map showing the way to a sacred cave system with underground springs. Enough water to sustain my people through any drought. Her voice hardened. We believe he brought it to this area, perhaps to search for it himself. A high-ranking officer who stayed on his horse while others did the killing. The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. If true, it meant Daniels, or whoever he really was, had orchestrated the massacre and was now hunting for something valuable enough to kill for. We need to move your people tonight, Mason decided, and then we need to find that map before he does. As darkness fell, Mason prepared to lead Elena back to her group. The risks were enormous. Harboring Apache fugitives could cost him his life if discovered, but the alternative was to abandon them to Blackwood's Indian hunters and a false sheriff with unknown motives. Before they left, Elena paused at the barn door, looking back at Mason with a complexity of emotions in her dark eyes. 7 years ago, you asked why I didn't make a sound when you removed the bullet, she said softly, even though I had no medicine for pain. Mason remembered. It had seemed almost supernatural, her control, her stillness. I didn't cry out, she continued, because I knew you were different. I saw it in your eyes when you found me. You didn't see an enemy to finish off. You saw a person. She straightened her shoulders. I've survived this long by knowing who to trust. I'm trusting you now, Mason Reed. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders as they slipped into the desert night, guided by stars older than any conflict between their peoples. Under the cover of darkness, Mason and Elena moved silently across the desert landscape. The night air carried a chill that belied the day's scorching heat, and overhead, stars crowded the sky in brilliant profusion. For people who knew how to read them, those stars were maps and calendars, as reliable as any paper document drawn by human hands. Elena led the way despite her injured leg, refusing Mason's offer to lean on him. Her resilience didn't surprise him. He'd witnessed it 7 years ago when he dug a bullet from her chest. What surprised him was his own response to her presence, a tangled mixture of guilt, admiration, and something deeper he couldn't name. They climbed the ridge behind Mason's property, following a narrow path visible only to experienced eyes. As they neared the top, Elena made a soft, bird-like call that was answered immediately from the rocks above. A moment later, a teenage boy emerged from the shadows, a knife clutched in his hand. Tarak, Elena said quietly, speaking in Apache. It's me. This man is... She paused, searching for the right description. A friend from before. The boy, Tarak, stared at Mason with undisguised suspicion. His lean frame suggested recent growth without adequate nourishment, and his eyes held the hard wariness of someone who had seen too much violence. "Where is Sarah?" asked a woman's voice as two more figures appeared. An older woman with deep lines etched into her face, and a younger one who moved with graceful caution. "Safe," Elena assured them. "At his place. We need to move now. Blackwood has hired Indian hunters." The news sent a visible ripple of fear through the small group. Another child emerged, a boy of about 10, clinging to the older woman's skirts. "This is Mason," Elena introduced him. "He knows somewhere we can hide." Mason nodded respectfully to each of them, noting their guarded expressions. "We should go quickly," he said. "Stay close and try to leave as little trace as possible." "Naya," Elena gestured to the younger woman, "help me gather our things." As the Apache group quickly packed their meager belongings, Mason kept watch, scanning the darkened valley below. His property looked peaceful from this height, the small cabin and barn mere silhouettes against the moonlit landscape. It struck him how tenuous his claim to that land truly was. Lines on a deed, a government stamp. The people beside him had a deeper connection to this earth, one written in blood and memory rather than ink. They descended the ridge on the opposite side from Mason's property, taking a circuitous route to avoid leaving an obvious trail. Mason led them toward a section of his land rarely visited, a jumble of rock formations that had been created by some ancient upheaval. Among these stood several small caves, naturally concealed by the surrounding terrain. "It's not much," Mason explained as they approached the largest cave, "but it's dry, defensible, and has a small water seep at the back." Elena nodded appreciatively. "Better than what we had, thank you." The cave, while modest in size, could comfortably shelter all six of them. Mason had brought blankets, some dried meat, and beans. As he helped them settle in, he observed their interactions, the way they communicated with minimal words, the practiced efficiency with which they established their new shelter. These were people accustomed to sudden displacement. The older woman, whom Elena introduced as Lena, arranged a small fire near the cave entrance where the smoke would dissipate among the rocks. Naya organized their supplies with careful attention to rationing. Tarak took up position near the entrance, his knife still in hand. "He doesn't speak much," Elena explained quietly, noticing Mason's gaze on the boy. "His father was killed by soldiers. His mother died at the reservation. Words abandoned him after that." Mason nodded in understanding. "I've seen it before. In the war, some men stopped speaking after particularly bad battles." As if sensing their conversation, Tarak glanced over, his dark eyes revealing an intelligence that belied his silence. His hands moved in a series of practiced motions, improvised sign language he had developed with the group. "He says he trusts you because of how you treat your horse," Elena translated. "Tarak believes animals know good people. Before the massacre, he was training to become a horse tamer." A shadow crossed her face. "The cavalry took his family's horses, prized Apache Mustangs, the day before the attack." Mason observed how the boy's fingers never strayed far from the knife at his belt, not as a threat, but as if the weapon were an extension of himself, perhaps the only remaining possession from his former life. "The boy, Apu," Elena continued, gesturing to the younger child who was now helping Lena with the fire, "is Naya's nephew. His parents were sent to different reservations. We hope to find them someday." Naya looked up at the mention of her name, her hands never ceasing their work as she organized their meager supplies with methodical precision. Though younger than Elena at perhaps 25, her movements carried the weightiness of someone much older. "Naya was a healer's apprentice," Elena explained, lowering her voice. "She memorized hundreds of medicinal plants before she was 20. When the government burned our medicinal gardens at the reservation, she secretly grew herbs in hidden places, risking punishment to treat the sick." Mason watched as Naya inspected his bandaging of Elena's wound with a critical eye, making small adjustments without comment. Her fingers worked with the confident precision of someone born to medicine, a kindred spirit to his own training, though from a vastly different tradition. She doesn't fully trust white medicine, Elena added with a hint of amusement, but she respects skill when she sees it. That's high praise from Naya. The casual cruelty of such separations wasn't new to Mason. He'd seen how the government's policies tore families apart in the name of civilizing the native peoples. It was one of many reasons he'd left the army, unable to reconcile his oath to heal with the suffering he was witnessing. Once the group was settled, Mason knew he should return to his cabin. If anyone came looking, his absence would raise suspicions. But something held him there, watching these survivors create a semblance of home in a cave not fit for animals. "I'll bring more supplies tomorrow night," he promised Elena, "and Sarah too, if it's safe." Elena's expression softened at the mention of the girl. "She trusts you already. That's rare." "She's different," Mason observed carefully. "Her mother was white?" A shadow crossed Elena's face. "Rebecca Walker. She came as a missionary but stayed because she found something worth believing in beyond her church teachings. She fell in love with River Hawk, one of our warriors." Elena's voice grew quiet. "They were both killed in the massacre. Sarah survived because Rebecca hid her in a storage basket when the shooting started." The story added another layer to the tragedy of Black Mountain, another thread in the tapestry of pain that connected them all. Mason thought of the silver cross around Sarah's neck, a relic of a mother she barely remembered, a bridge between worlds as the child herself had described it. "She speaks of her mother as if they still talk," Mason noted. Elena smiled faintly. "Our people believe those who have crossed to the spirit world can still guide us. Sarah maintains her mother's language so she can hear her voice in the wind." The poetic beauty of the belief struck Mason deeply. In his years of scientific training, he'd been taught to dismiss such notions as superstition. Yet standing here, in this ancient landscape under stars that had witnessed countless human struggles, such spiritual connections seemed entirely possible. "I should go," he said finally. "I'll return tomorrow night. If anything happens before then—" He hesitated, realizing they had no way to signal him. "We know how to stay hidden," Elena assured him. "We've had practice." As Mason turned to leave, Elena reached out and caught his arm. Her touch was light but firm. "Mason," she said, her voice low, "be careful with the sheriff. If he is who I think he is, he's dangerous beyond measure." Mason nodded, the warning settling into his bones alongside all the other dangers now gathering around him. "Get some rest," he advised. "That leg needs time to heal." The journey back to his cabin seemed longer in the stillness of deep night. Mason's thoughts churned with everything he'd learned: the water map, the murdered soldier, the false sheriff, the desperate flight of Elena's people. By the time he reached his property, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the stars fading as the earth turned inexorably toward dawn. Sarah was awake, sitting on his porch swing with her legs dangling. The sight of the child waiting for him, unafraid and seemingly at home, created an unexpected warmth in Mason's chest. "They're safe?" she asked as he approached. "Yes," he assured her. "We'll go to them tonight if it's safe." Sarah nodded, accepting his word without question. "I made coffee," she announced proudly. "Elena taught me how." Inside, Mason found a pot of coffee boiling on the stove, strong enough to stand a spoon in, as his father used to say. The normalcy of it was disconcerting after the tension of the night. He poured a cup, adding a generous amount of milk before handing it to Sarah. "Thank you," he said, pouring his own cup. "Where did you learn to build a fire that hot?" "Watching," Sarah replied simply. "I watch everything." Mason believed her. Those green eyes seemed to absorb details others might miss, cataloging the world with quiet intelligence. As they sat together on the porch, sipping their coffee and watching the sun rise over the distant mountains, Mason felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some cosmic balance had been restored. "You have sad eyes," Sarah observed suddenly. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the perceptive comment. "Do I?" She nodded. "Like you're carrying something heavy that you can't put down." The accuracy of her assessment was unsettling. "Maybe I am," he acknowledged. "My mother used to say that some burdens are meant to be shared," Sarah continued, swinging her legs rhythmically. "That's why people find each other." Before Mason could respond to this piece of wisdom, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. He quickly ushered Sarah inside, instructing her to stay in the back room and remain silent. Sheriff Daniels rode into view a few minutes later, his posture military straight despite the early hour. Mason stepped onto the porch, coffee cup still in hand, feigning casual surprise. "Sheriff," he called, "early rounds today?" Daniels dismounted with the fluid ease of a much younger man. "Dr. Reed, thought I'd catch you before you started your day." His sharp eyes scanned the property. "Mind if I come in for some of that coffee? Smells mighty fine." Mason hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Of course, just made a fresh pot." Inside, Mason poured a cup for Daniels, acutely aware of Sarah hiding just one room away. If the sheriff heard or sensed anything unusual, they would both be in grave danger. He kept his movements deliberate and calm, betraying nothing of his inner tension. "I've identified that body I mentioned," Daniel said, accepting the coffee. "Frank Miller, former cavalry, as I suspected." "You mentioned that yesterday," Mason reminded him, leaning against the counter. "Did I?" Daniel smiled thinly. "Memory must be slipping. Getting old, I suppose." He sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving Mason's face. "Strange thing, though. Miller was discharged from the Army 6 years ago, but he had a letter on him dated just 3 months back, from someone in this region, arranging a meeting about a discovery of mutual interest." "Interesting," Mason commented neutrally. "Any idea what that might be?" "I have theories." Daniel set down his cup and began to wander around the small cabin, examining Mason's sparse belongings with unsettling interest. "You were an Army doctor. Ever hear rumors about an Apache treasure map? Something the Indians called the water map?" The direct question nearly caught Mason off guard. "Can't say that I have. Sounds like prospector talk." "Perhaps." Daniels paused before the window where the Apache protection charm hung, studying it with narrowed eyes. "Unusual decoration for a white man's home." Mason shrugged. "Picked it up years ago, like the craftsmanship." Daniels turned back to face him, his expression unreadable. "You know, doctor, in my experience, most men have secrets, things they'd rather not have exposed to daylight." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "The trick to peaceful coexistence is knowing which secrets can be tolerated and which can't." The threat was thinly veiled, and Mason felt cold anger rise within him. Before he could respond, a small sound came from the back room, the faintest creak of a floorboard. Daniel's head turned sharply toward the noise. "Something in your pantry need attention?" he asked with dangerous softness. Mason forced a casual smile. "Just the house settling. These old cabins talk to themselves, especially as the day warms up." Daniels held his gaze for a long, tense moment, then nodded as if accepting the explanation. "Well, I won't take up more of your morning." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "One more thing, doctor. Blackwood mentioned he visited you yesterday, said he had concerns about Apache fugitives possibly hiding in the area." "Blackwood sees Apache raiders behind every cactus," Mason replied. "Always has. He's requested permission to search all properties in the valley, including yours." Daniels watched for Mason's reaction. "I'm considering granting it, given the circumstances." "And what circumstances would those be, Sheriff?" "Public safety." Daniels opened the door. "These aren't peaceful times, Dr. Reed. Man has to choose which side he's standing on." After Daniels departed, Mason waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely before going to the back room. Sarah sat perfectly still in the corner, her eyes wide but not fearful. "That man is not a sheriff," she whispered. "I know," Mason agreed, kneeling before her. "Did you recognize him?" Sarah shook her head. "But he feels wrong, like a snake pretending to be a rabbit." The description was apt, and Mason felt a chill at the child's intuition. "We need to be very careful around him, and we need to get you back to Elena tonight." Throughout the day, Mason maintained his normal routine, tending his animals and garden with deliberate normalcy. Mason had decided it was safer to approach the cave from a different direction tonight, taking a longer route to avoid creating a discernible path between his property and their hiding place. As they rested briefly during their journey, Mason noticed how Elena naturally positioned herself where she could observe both Sarah and the surrounding landscape, a protective instinct that mirrored his medical one. They had developed an unspoken understanding in these few days, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for vulnerabilities without need for discussion. When she winced slightly, adjusting her position, He silently offered her water, and when his breathing grew labored on steeper terrain, she moderated their pace without comment. It was the quiet coordination of two people who had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. They were halfway to the cave when Mason sensed rather than heard a presence nearby. He stopped abruptly, pulling Sarah close to his side. The night had gone unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no small animals rustling in the brush. "Someone's following us," he whispered to Sarah. "Stay very close." They changed direction, moving toward a cluster of boulders that offered cover. Mason's hand went to the pistol at his hip, ready to defend the child if necessary. But the presence, whoever it was, remained elusive, a shadow tracking their movements without revealing itself. When they finally reached the cave, Mason was tense with hypervigilance. Elena met them at the entrance, immediately embracing Sarah before turning concerned eyes to Mason. "What's wrong?" she asked, reading his expression. "I think we were followed, but I never saw who it was." He scanned the darkness behind them. "We need to be prepared to move again if necessary." Inside the cave, the others greeted Sarah warmly while maintaining a wary distance from Mason. Only Tarak seemed more relaxed than before, offering Mason a small nod of acknowledgement when their eyes met. "His leg is better," Elena explained, noticing Mason's surprise. "You have medicine in your bag?" Mason nodded. "Brought supplies for everyone, including something for your wound." In the firelight, Mason noticed how the golden glow accentuated Elena's features, revealing both strength and vulnerability rarely visible in daylight. Their eyes met briefly as he finished checking her wound, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The debt of life, now balanced by a shared purpose. "You have gentle hands for a soldier," she remarked quietly. "I was never much of a soldier," Mason admitted. "Just a doctor who wore a uniform." When he finished redressing her wound, Elena didn't immediately move away. Instead, she studied him with those perceptive dark eyes. "You never told me why you left the army," she said. "Was it because of Black Mountain?" Mason's hand stilled on his medical bag. "Yes," he answered simply. "I couldn't serve under men who would order something like that. Couldn't be part of a system that saw your people as obstacles to be removed. So you came here instead, to land that once belonged to my ancestors." There was no accusation in her tone, just a statement of fact, but Mason felt the weight of it nonetheless. "I didn't think of it that way when I claimed it," he admitted. "Should have, maybe, but I was just looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere I could live with myself." Elena nodded, understanding in her expression. "And have you found that peace with yourself?" "Not yet," Mason said honestly. "Maybe not ever." Their conversation was interrupted when Naya approached with bowls of the stew Mason had brought. As they ate, Sarah regaled the group with descriptions of Mason's cabin, his animals, and the harmonica he had promised to teach her to play. The simple joy in her voice as she spoke brought smiles to even the most guarded faces. Later, as the others prepared for sleep, Elena beckoned Mason to join her near the cave entrance. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the vast desert sky, and a slight breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. "I need to tell you the whole truth," she said without preamble, "about why we came back to this place." Mason settled beside her, sensing the importance of what was to come. "The water map is real," Elena began. "It shows the way to a system of caves with underground springs, enough water to sustain many people through any drought. But that's not all it shows." She paused, weighing her next words carefully. "The caves also contain gold, not veins in the rock like miners seek, but ceremonial items gathered over generations. Our ancestors' treasures, hidden away for safekeeping." Mason absorbed this information, understanding now why Daniels, or whoever he really was, would kill for such a map. "And you believe one of the cavalry soldiers took it during the massacre?" Elena nodded. "Our shaman, Gray Fox, always carried it. After the attack, his body was found stripped of all sacred items, including the map." Her voice hardened with controlled anger. "They didn't just take lives that day. They took our future. And you think this Frank Miller was the one who took it?" "I believe he was involved, yes. We heard rumors about a soldier trying to sell information about Apache gold." Elena's gaze remained fixed on the distant stars. "We came looking for him, hoping to recover what was stolen. But someone else found him first." Mason considered everything he'd learned about the false sheriff in the blood-stained map. Daniels, he mused aloud. If he's really a former officer as you suspect, he might have known about the map all along. Maybe even ordered Miller to take it during the massacre. It would explain why he's here now, posing as a lawman. Elena turned to face him directly. The drought has made water more valuable than gold. With both, a man could control the entire territory. The pieces were aligning into a disturbing picture. Mason had stumbled into a complex web of greed, deception, and old wrongs seeking rectification. And at the center of it all, a child with the green eyes who somehow connected everything. Sarah, he said quietly. She's more important to this than I first realized, isn't she? Elena's expression softened at the mention of the girl. Sarah is special. Rebecca Walker, her mother, was not just any missionary. She was educated, came from a wealthy family back east. She fell in love with Riverhawk and chose our way of life over returning to her people. Elena hesitated, then continued. Before she died, Rebecca created something, a way to ensure the water map would never be lost again, even if the original was stolen. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Elena called softly to Sarah, who had been sitting nearby, seemingly absorbed in watching the stars. The girl approached, her expression solemn as if she understood the gravity of the moment. Show him, Elena instructed gently. Sarah reached for the silver cross around her neck, turning it over to reveal intricate markings etched into the back, symbols that matched what Mason had glimpsed on the blood-stained map Daniels had shown him. Mother made it, Sarah explained. She said it would help find the way home when the time was right. Mason stared at the delicate engravings, recognition dawning. Part of the water map, he breathed, copied onto the cross. Elena nodded. Rebecca was clever. She knew the soldiers would take anything that looked valuable or sacred to us, but would leave a Christian symbol alone. Her expression grew sad. She didn't live to see if her plan worked, but she gave her daughter a legacy and a responsibility. Sarah returned the cross to its place against her chest, handling it with reverence beyond her years. Mother said water is life, and life is sacred, she recited. She said someday I would help my people find their way home. The child's certainty was both touching and troubling. Mason looked from Sarah to Elena, understanding now why they had risked so much to return to this dangerous territory. Not just for water or gold, but for a promise made by a dying mother to ensure her daughter's heritage survived. Daniel suspects something, Mason warned. He asked specifically about the water map this morning, and if he connects Sarah to Rebecca Walker, he must never find her, Elena said with quiet intensity. If he is who I think he is, he wouldn't hesitate to use a child to get what he wants. Mason's protective instincts surged unexpectedly. In just days, Sarah had become more than just a refugee he was helping. She had awakened something long dormant within him, a capacity for care he'd thought had died along with his faith in humanity. We need to decipher the full map, he decided. Compare what's on the cross with what's left of the original. Then find these caves before Daniels or Blackwood do. It's dangerous, Elena cautioned, especially for you. If they discover you're helping us. I made my choice when I didn't turn you away, Mason replied simply. Besides, I'm tired of looking over my shoulder for redemption. Maybe it's time to walk toward it instead. As Sarah drifted off to sleep nearby, Mason and Elena continued their quiet conversation, planning their next moves with the careful precision of those whose lives depended on every detail. The night deepened around them, the ancient stars bearing silent witness to this unlikely alliance forged in shared purpose and growing trust. Neither noticed the figure watching from the distant rocks, a shadow among shadows, observing their interaction with calculated interest before slipping away into the desert night. The following morning brought oppressive heat that shimmered above the sand by mid-morning. Mason returned to his cabin alone, leaving Sarah safely with Elena despite the child's protests. They had agreed it was too dangerous for her to remain at his property with Daniel's suspicious eyes watching. As Mason approached his cabin, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it securely before leaving. Drawing his pistol, he moved cautiously toward the entrance, listening for any sound from within. The interior had been systematically searched, drawers pulled open, his few books scattered on the floor. the mattress upended on his bed frame. Even the floorboards beneath his bed had been pried up, exposing the hiding place where he had once kept Elena's mother's charm. Mason carefully checked every room, but the intruder was long gone. Nothing seemed to be missing. This had been a search rather than a theft. A search for what, he could guess all too well. Outside, he examined the ground around his cabin. Multiple boot prints circled the property. At least 3 different men, judging by the variations in size and tread pattern. They had made no effort to conceal their presence, suggesting either confidence or official sanction. The violation of his home left Mason seething with quiet anger. For years he had lived peacefully here, bothering no one, asking only for the same in return. Now, in the span of days, his solitary existence had been shattered. First by Elena and Sarah's arrival, then by Blackwood's threats, Daniel's manipulations, and now this invasion of his private space. Yet oddly, he found himself more concerned about the threats to his newfound companions than about the disruption to his own life. Somehow Elena and her small band of survivors had awakened his dormant sense of purpose. Sarah's innocent faith in him had rekindled something he'd thought extinguished after Black Mountain, a belief that he could still make a difference, still be worthy of trust. Mason spent the day restoring order to his cabin while considering his next move. He needed to see the bloodstained map again, to compare it with the engravings on Sarah's cross. But requesting another look from Daniels would only increase the false sheriff's suspicions. He needed a different approach. By late afternoon, he had formulated a plan. Saddling his horse, he rode toward town with deliberate unhurriedness, as if on a routine supply trip. The settlement was small, a single street of businesses, a church, and scattered houses radiating outward. The sheriff's office stood at the far end, a solid adobe structure with barred windows and a hitching post out front. Mason tied his horse at the general store first, purchasing coffee, sugar, and ammunition with casual friendliness toward the shopkeeper. He inquired about local news, commented on the drought, and generally established his presence as unremarkable and ordinary. As he loaded his purchases into his saddlebags, he noticed Blackwood and 2 of his men emerging from the saloon across the street. Mason nodded acknowledgement without approaching, maintaining the cool distance that had characterized their relationship since his departure from the army. With his errands as cover, Mason made his way to the sheriff's office. Luck was with him. The building stood empty, its door locked, but its side window unlatched. After ensuring no one was watching, Mason slipped around to the window and eased it open, climbing through with the stealth his army days had taught him. The office was sparsely furnished: a desk, a gun rack, a small iron stove, and a cabinet presumably containing official documents. At the rear, a single cell with a barred door stood empty, its mattress rolled neatly on a metal frame. Mason went straight to the desk, searching for the bloodstained map. The top drawers yielded nothing of interest: wanted posters, ammunition, a bottle of whiskey. The bottom drawer was locked, but yielded to Mason's pocket knife with minimal resistance. Inside, he found a leather folder containing several documents. Among them was the map, its bloodstains now dried to a rusty brown that obscured much of the content. Mason carefully removed it, studying what remained visible. The symbols along the edges matched those on Sarah's cross, but represented only a portion of what must have been a complete guide to the cave system. As he examined the map, Mason noticed another document beneath it, a yellowed letter bearing a government seal. Curiosity prompted him to read it, and what he found sent a chill through him. Colonel James Hayes is hereby granted extended leave to pursue matters of personal interest, with the understanding that any discoveries of strategic value will be reported to the appropriate authorities. The letter continued, but the name alone was enough. Colonel James Hayes, a senior officer who had authorized the Black Mountain operation from a distance, never directly implicated in the massacre, but certainly its architect. Hayes had been reported killed 2 years after Black Mountain in a skirmish with Comanche raiders to the east. Yet here was evidence that Hayes had received special dispensation to operate independently. And if Elena was right, this same man now posed as Sheriff Daniels, hunting for the water map that had eluded him 7 years ago. The sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside sent Mason into swift action. He quickly replaced the documents, closed the drawer, and moved to the window through which he'd entered. As the door handle turned, and he slipped outside, easing the window closed behind him. Mason walked casually to his horse, mounted, and rode away at an unhurried pace. Inside his head, however, his thoughts raced. Hayes was alive, masquerading as Daniels, and clearly still obsessed with finding the Apache treasure. The question was, why? Simple greed seemed insufficient motivation for a man of his former rank and standing. The sun was setting as Mason returned to his property, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Rather than stopping at his cabin, he continued toward the hidden cave where Elena and her people were sheltering. He needed to share what he had discovered and compare the map symbols with those on Sarah's cross. As he approached the rocky area, however, instinct made him slow his pace. Something felt wrong. The usual evening sounds of the desert seemed muted, and the air carried a tension he recognized from his days on the battlefield. Mason dismounted, tethering his horse behind a large boulder, and continued on foot with his rifle ready. He moved silently, using the terrain for cover, all senses alert for danger. When he reached the cave entrance, he found it empty. No fire, no supplies, no sign of Elena or the others. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had they been discovered? Captured? Killed? Then his eye caught a small arrangement of stones near the cave entrance, 3 stacked vertically with a 4th placed to the west. A message, he realized. They had moved west and wanted him to follow. Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by renewed concern. Something had spooked them enough to abandon their shelter. Mason backtracked to his horse and continued westward, scanning for signs of their passage while assuring he left minimal trace of his own. As darkness descended fully, he spotted a flicker of light in the distance, so brief he might have imagined it. But instinct told him to follow, and after tethering his horse again, he approached on foot with careful stealth. The new hiding place was smaller than the cave, a natural hollow beneath an overhanging rock, partially screened by scrub brush. Elena stood guard at its edge, a rifle across her lap that Mason recognized as an old cavalry model. "Mason," she greeted him with palpable relief. "We feared something had happened to you." "Someone searched my cabin today," he told her, crouching beside her. "Why did you move?" "Tarek saw men on the ridge this afternoon watching the cave. We didn't wait to meet them." Her expression was grim. "Blackwood's hunters, we think." Inside the hollow, the others were huddled together for warmth, the children asleep despite their precarious situation. Mason noted the group's dwindling supplies and the fatigue evident in their postures. "I found something," he said quietly to Elena, relating his discovery at the sheriff's office. "Hayes is alive, and he's here as Daniels. I saw documentation." Elena's face hardened at the confirmation of her suspicions. "He's a man who gets what he wants, no matter the amount. At Black Mountain, it was land for cattle. Now it's water and gold." "We need to decipher the complete map," Mason pressed. "Compare what I saw with Sarah's cross." Elena hesitated, glancing at the sleeping child. "There's more," she admitted. "Something I didn't tell you before." She pulled Sarah's cross from her own pocket. The child had entrusted it to her keeping while she slept. "Turn it in the firelight. Look at it from an angle." Mason took the silver cross, tilting it as instructed. As the firelight played across its surface, he noticed something remarkable. Faint lines, nearly invisible when viewed straight on, that became apparent when the light hit them at certain angles. "Rebecca was clever," Elena explained. "She etched the main landmarks deep enough to be seen easily, but the connecting paths and water sources she inscribed was something that only shows in certain light. Even if someone stole this, they might miss half of what it shows." Mason studied the delicate markings with newfound appreciation. "This is only part of the map, though. The original must have contained more detail." "Yes, and I believe Hayes, Daniels, has been searching for both pieces all these years." Elena reclaimed the cross, tucking it safely away. "If he finds us, finds Sarah." The implication hung heavy between them. Hayes would stop at nothing to obtain the complete map, even if it meant harming a child. "We need to find these caves first," Mason decided. "Get your people to safety, then deal with Hayes." Elena's dark eyes held his in the dim light. "And Blackwood? His hunters?" "One problem at a time," Mason counseled, though he shared her concern. They were outnumbered and outgunned, caught between 2 dangerous forces with nowhere left to run. As if sensing his thoughts, Elena reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. You could walk away from this, she said softly. Return to your life, we would understand. The offer surprised him, not because it was made, but because it held no appeal whatsoever. The solitary existence he had maintained for years now seemed hollow compared to the purpose he had found in helping these people, in helping her. My life changed the moment you walked back into it, Mason replied, the admission easier than he had expected. I'm not walking away. In the darkness of the desert night, surrounded by dangers on all sides, they shared a moment of connection that transcended words. Two souls who had survived tragedy and found in each other a possibility neither had dared to imagine. The moment was broken by a soft sound from the hollow behind them. Sarah had awakened and now approached, her green eyes luminous in the faint firelight. I dreamed of water, she announced, as if this were the most natural thing in the world to report. Underground rivers that sing. Mother was there, showing the way. Elena and Mason exchanged glances, the child's words striking them both as something more than a simple dream. Did she show you where to find these rivers? Mason asked gently. Sarah nodded with solemn certainty. Black Mountains, he said, where everything ended. That's where we need to go to begin again. The mountain where the massacre had occurred, the place where Mason had failed to stop a tragedy, the site of Hayes's greatest crime and perhaps his greatest obsession. It seemed fitting somehow that their path would lead back to where it all began, the scene of so much death now possibly holding the key to survival. As Mason looked from Sarah to Elena, he felt the weight of history pressing upon them all, and the fragile promise of redemption that might lie ahead. Then that's where we'll go, he decided, his voice steady despite the dangers such a journey would entail. Together. The fire crackled softly as they began to plan, the stars overhead bearing witness to this unlikely alliance of the wounded and the hopeful, united in their quest for justice and survival in a land that had taken much from them all. That night, as they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, Mason observed the small group's dynamics with newfound appreciation. What had initially appeared as simple survival had deeper currents of community and purpose. Tarak tested the edge of his knife against his thumb before showing Kai how to sharpen a stick into a serviceable tool. Though no words passed between them, the careful instruction in the boy's rapt attention spoke volumes. The teenager's silence wasn't emptiness, Mason realized, but a different kind of fullness. Observation, awareness, protection. Naya sorted through a small pouch of dried plants, separating certain leaves and berries. She approached Mason with a handful of crushed herbs. For wound, stops blood, fights fever, she said, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. She demonstrated how to apply the mixture, her methodical movements revealing her expertise. Your medicine good, this better for desert. It wasn't criticism, but collaboration, the beginning of trust between healers. Across the fire, Lena's soft voice rose in a melodic chant, barely audible yet somehow filling the space between them. Sarah leaned against her, eyelids growing heavy as the elder woman's fingers gently braided her hair, weaving in a small turquoise bead. Protection for the journey, Mason guessed. Elena, catching Mason's thoughtful observation, moved to sit beside him. Before the reservations, before the wars, this is how we lived, she said quietly, each with their gift, their purpose, the young learning from the old, the strong protecting the vulnerable, the healers tending both body and spirit. Mason understood then what they were truly fighting for, not just survival, but the preservation of this intricate web of connection, knowledge, and mutual care that no government policy or forced relocation could fully destroy. It was a way of being in the world that his own people had perhaps forgotten in their rush toward what they called progress. Dawn broke across the Arizona desert in a wash of pale gold, the rising sun setting the horizon ablaze while deep shadows still clung to the western slopes of Black Mountain. The imposing silhouette stood like a sentinel against the morning sky, its dark mass a reminder of blood spilled and lives shattered. Mason studied the mountain through his field glasses, mapping their approach from a ridge half a mile away. The journey had taken them most of the night, a careful, circuitous route to avoid Blackwood's men and Hayes's patrols. Elena moved with the quiet resilience Mason had come to admire, her physical discomfort betrayed only by the occasional tightness around her eyes when navigating difficult terrain. Now their small party rested in the shadow of a rock outcropping. Mason, Elena, Sarah, and Tarek, who had insisted on coming despite Elena's initial objections. The others remained at the new hiding place, Naya taking charge with quiet competence. There, Mason said, passing the field glasses to Elena. See the ravine cutting up from the south? According to the map fragment, that's our entry point. Elena studied the terrain, her expression giving nothing away. But Mason had come to recognize the subtle signs of her distress, the slight tightening around her eyes, the carefully measured breathing. This mountain held her worst memories, just as it did his. It looks different in daylight, she said finally, lowering the glasses. Last time I was here, it was dawn, with gun smoke everywhere and people screaming. Mason nodded, the images from that day still vivid in his own mind. We'll approach through the ravine, he decided, less exposed that way. Tarak, who had been scouting the surrounding area, returned with the silent efficiency that characterized his movements. He made a series of hand gestures to Elena, his face grave. Riders, Elena translated for Mason, coming from the east. 4 men. Mason took back the field glasses, scanning the direction Tarak had indicated. Sure enough, dust rose from the hooves of approaching horses. Even at this distance, he recognized Blackwood's distinctive black stallion in the lead. They're following our trail, Mason realized. We need to move, now. They descended quickly toward the ravine, staying low and using what cover the sparse vegetation provided. Sarah kept pace between Elena and Mason, her small face set with a determination that belied her years. The cross hung visible at her neck now, no longer hidden, but displayed as if its significance had somehow shifted from secret to talisman. The ravine offered welcome shelter, its steep walls blocking the morning sun and providing shadow to mask their movement. The ground was rocky but navigable, with occasional patches of hardy desert plants clinging to crevices where moisture collected. As they progressed upward, the ravine narrowed, forcing them into single file with Tarak leading the way, his hunting knife drawn and ready. Sarah, Mason said quietly as they climbed, you mentioned your mother showed you underground rivers in your dream. Did she show you exactly where to find them? The girl nodded without breaking stride. There's a special rock shaped like a sleeping bear. Behind it, the earth opens up. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a child reciting something fundamental and unquestionable. Mother said we'd know it by the 3 white stones placed in a row. Mason glanced at Elena, wondering if such a landmark actually existed or if the child was simply processing their quest through the language of dreams. Elena's expression suggested she shared his uncertainty. Riverhawk used to speak of a sacred cave, Elena offered, a place where our ancestors left treasures for future generations. But few knew its exact location. She kept her voice low, though they were far from any listeners. Rebecca might have learned of it from him. The ravine grew steeper as they ascended, requiring them to use their hands to steady themselves against the rock walls. Mason found himself constantly checking on Sarah, ready to assist her, but the child navigated the terrain with the nimble assurance of someone born to this landscape. Wait, Tarek suddenly hissed, the first word Mason had heard from the boy's lips. He had frozen in place, one hand raised in warning. They all went still, listening. At first, Mason heard nothing beyond their own breathing and the occasional skitter of small rocks dislodged by their passage. Then it came, the distant sound of voices echoing down the ravine, approaching from above. Someone's coming down, Mason whispered. From the mountain. Tarak pointed to a narrow fissure in the ravine wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Without hesitation, Elena ushered Sarah toward it, then followed, her slim form disappearing into the shadow. Tarak went next, moving like smoke. Mason, broader in the shoulders than the others, found the passage a tight fit, the rough stones scraping against his back as he edged sideways into the crevice. Inside, the space opened slightly, not enough to stand comfortably, but sufficient to conceal them all if they remained pressed against the back wall. Through the narrow opening, they watched as 2 men descended the ravine, rifles slung across their backs. They wore dusty range clothes and wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the sun. Indian hunters, judging by the tracking equipment attached to their belts. Waste of time, one was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. Ain't no Apache gonna return to a killing ground, They're superstitious about death. Blackwood's paying us to be thorough, the other replied. And Hayes wants every inch of this mountain checked. He spat into the dust. Figure they're both chasing ghosts, but their money spends just fine. Mason felt Elena tense beside him at the casual mention of Hayes's name. Confirmation of their suspicions. Daniels was indeed Hayes, and he was working with Blackwood despite their apparent public friction. You hear about the map Hayes is obsessed with? The first man continued as they moved past the hidden group's position. Some kind of Apache treasure map? Johnson says Hayes has been hunting it for years. Their voices faded as they continued down the ravine, but the fragment of conversation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Hayes and Blackwood were cooperating, at least to some degree, and Hayes's obsession with the water map was common knowledge among their hired men. They waited several minutes after the sounds had faded before venturing out of their hiding place. Tarak immediately climbed to a vantage point, scanning both directions to ensure the way was clear. While Elena and Mason discussed their plans, Sarah drifted toward Lena, who sat somewhat apart from the others, her weathered hands weaving a small basket from desert grasses. The older woman's face remained impassive, lined with decades of hardship, but her fingers moved with surprising delicacy. She's making a water carrier, Sarah explained to Mason, who had noticed their interaction. Lena can find water in places no one else can. She knows the plants that point to underground streams. Lena looked up, meeting Mason's gaze directly for the first time. Her eyes held the same fierce pride he'd seen in Elena's, but tempered with something deeper. A wisdom born of survival. Lena was a tribal elder's wife, Elena said. She kept our stories, our songs. When they took her sons to the school, they cut their hair and forbade them to speak our language. Elena hesitated. The younger one died of fever. The older ran away, trying to return home. They found him. She didn't finish. Lena suddenly spoke, her voice rough from disuse but clear. I weave what remains, she said in perfect accented English. My husband's stories, my son's futures, my people's water vessels. Her gaze returned to her work. What is broken can be rewoven, different but still holding water. Mason recognized the philosophy in her craft, a resilience more powerful than mere endurance. He'd seen it in battlefield surgeons who fashioned medical tools from whatever was available, refusing to surrender to circumstances. We need to hurry, Elena said, her voice tight with urgency. If they're searching the mountain systematically, we don't have much time. They continued upward with greater caution now, alert to the possibility of encountering more searchers. The ravine eventually opened onto a plateau dotted with juniper trees and barrel cacti, the site where the Apache village had once stood. Mason felt the weight of history pressed down upon him as they emerged onto the plateau. Nothing obvious remained of the settlement. No structures, no artifacts, just an emptiness that spoke of deliberate erasure. Yet knowing what had happened here made the ground beneath his feet feel somehow consecrated by suffering. Elena stopped at the edge of the plateau, her face a mask of contained emotion. 53 people lived here, she said softly. 39 died where we're standing. The rest were scattered like seeds in the wind. Mason didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared responsibility for ensuring such things never happened again. Sarah, however, showed none of the adult's hesitation. She walked purposefully across the plateau, her gaze fixed on the mountainside beyond. This way, she called, her voice carrying in the morning stillness. They followed, watching as the child navigated the terrain with uncanny confidence, as if following a map visible only to her. She led them toward a tumble of massive boulders that had fallen from the heights above, creating a natural labyrinth at the base of a steep cliff. There, Sarah pointed, stopping before a boulder that indeed resembled a sleeping bear, its weathered surface humped like a back, with a smaller protrusion suggesting a head. And look, the 3 white stones. Mason might have missed them if not for her direction. 3 pale quartz stones arranged in a precise line at the base of the bare rock. They seemed deliberately placed, too regular to be a natural occurrence. Rebecca did this, Elena realized aloud. She marked the way. Tarek was already examining the area behind the bare rock, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of an opening. He moved several smaller rocks, revealing a dark space beneath the larger boulder, a gap just wide enough for a person to crawl through. Is that it? Mason asked Sarah. The entrance your mother showed you? The girl nodded, clutching her cross. The singing rivers are below. Mason knelt to peer into the opening. Cool air flowed outward, carrying the unmistakable scent of water, a miracle in this parched landscape. He could see nothing beyond the initial passage, but the sound of distant dripping confirmed that something lay within. I'll go first, he decided, removing his pack. Check that it's safe. Elena caught his arm. We go together, she said firmly. All of us. Her eyes conveyed what her words did not. They had come too far, risked too much to separate now. Mason nodded his understanding. Tarak, you lead Sarah. I'll follow, then Elena. The boy nodded, gesturing for Sarah to hand him her small pack before dropping to his knees at the entrance. He disappeared into the darkness with the fluid grace of a desert creature returning to its element. Sarah followed without hesitation, her small form swallowed by shadows. Mason went next, the tight space scraping against his shoulders as he crawled forward. The passage descended at a sharp angle, forcing him to brace himself against the sides to control his movement. The smell of water grew stronger, and the temperature dropped perceptibly as he moved deeper. After about 20 feet, the passage widened suddenly, opening into a space large enough to stand. Mason rose cautiously, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. Tarak and Sarah waited a few feet ahead, their figures silhouetted against a faint, diffuse light coming from deeper within the cave. Once Elena had joined them, they moved forward together, following the subtle illumination. The source soon became apparent, a narrow fissure in the ceiling far above, allowing a shaft of sunlight to penetrate the darkness. It fell upon a small underground pool, the water so clear it seemed almost invisible until the light caught its gentle ripples. Water, Elena breathed, the word carrying reverence beyond its simple meaning. In the desert, water meant life itself. But the pool was just the beginning. As they ventured deeper, the cave system revealed itself in stages, each chamber more remarkable than the last. Stalactites hung like stone icicles from ceilings that soared beyond the reach of their sight. Stalagmites rose from the floor in fantastic formations, shaped by millennia of patient water drops. And everywhere the sound of water moving through hidden channels. The singing rivers of Sarah's dream. This place is enormous, Mason marveled, as they entered a cathedral-like chamber where multiple water sources converged into a larger pool. The acoustics amplified the water's gentle music, creating the impression of whispered conversations just beyond hearing. Look, Sarah pointed to the far wall of the chamber. Mother's pictures. They approached carefully, Mason lighting a small lantern he'd brought in his pack. The beam revealed a series of petroglyphs etched into the smooth stone surface, ancient symbols similar to those on the water map in Sarah's cross, but more extensive, telling a story across the rock face. These are old, Elena said with quiet awe, from before the Spanish came. Our ancestors recorded the water paths here, and she trailed off, her fingers tracing a section of symbols Mason couldn't interpret. What is it? He asked. Instructions, Elena translated slowly. For ceremonies, but also for survival. How to store food in these caves, how to defend them if necessary. Her voice took on a note of wonder. This is what the water map led to, not just water and gold, but knowledge. A way for our people to endure. As they followed the petroglyphs, the cave chamber narrowed into a passage that descended further into the mountain. The air grew cooler, damper, the sound of water more pronounced. The passage eventually opened into a smaller chamber, this one clearly modified by human hands. The walls smoothed in places, niches carved at regular intervals. And in those niches, illuminated now by Mason's lantern, rested the treasures of Elena's ancestors. Gold objects, ceremonial bowls, ornate jewelry, small sculptures of animals and deities. Not the vast fortune that would inspire white men's greed, but cultural artifacts of irreplaceable value to the people who had created them. The gold haze seeks, Elena said softly, not for its worth in white men's terms, but for what it represents. Our history, our connection to this land. Sarah moved to the center of the chamber where a flat stone rose like an altar. On its surface lay a weathered leather pouch. The child reached for it without hesitation, as if she had known it would be waiting. Mothers, she said simply, opening the pouch to reveal a folded paper inside. yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Mason leaned closer as Sarah unfolded the document. It was a letter written in an educated woman's flowing script. My beloved daughter, if you are reading this, I have gone to walk among the stars, but I have kept my promise to lead you home. The caves will shelter our people when the rains fail and the earth cracks with thirst. The treasures here belong to your father's ancestors. Keep them safe from those who would take without understanding. There is one more secret I entrust to you. Look to the cross I gave you. Hold it to the light where the sun and water meet. What seems empty will be filled. What seems lost will be found. Remember that you are the bridge between two worlds, Sarah. In you, the best of both can flourish. Find Mason Reed. He has a healer's hands and a heart that seeks redemption. Trust him as I would have. With endless love, your mother, Rebecca Walker Hayes. The name struck Mason like a physical blow. Hayes, Rebecca Walker Hayes. The connection suddenly crystallized. Rebecca had been Hayes's daughter. Sarah was his granddaughter. Elena had seen it too, her face registering shock as she processed the implication. Hayes is hunting his own flesh and blood, she whispered, horror evident in her voice. Does he know? He must, Mason reasoned, the pieces falling into place. That's why he's been so obsessed, why he's here posing as the sheriff. Not just for gold or water, but for Sarah, the last connection to his daughter. Sarah looked between them, her young mind grappling with revelations beyond her years. The bad sheriff is my grandfather? She asked, her voice small but steady. Yes, Elena confirmed gently. Your mother's father. But that doesn't make him family, Sarah. Family protects. It doesn't hunt. The child nodded, accepting this distinction with the same solemn wisdom she brought to everything. She returned to the letter, pointing to a specific passage. Look to the cross, she read, where the sun and water meet. Mason glanced around the chamber, noticing how the shaft of sunlight from above fell directly upon the central pool, creating patterns of reflected light that danced across the cave walls. There, he indicated, the light on the water. Sarah removed her silver cross, holding it where the sunlight refracted through the water. The effect was immediate and startling. The light passing through the cross projected an enlarged image onto the smooth cave wall, revealing markings that had been invisible to the naked eye. The complete water map, encoded in miniature within the engravings on the cross. Ingenious, Mason breathed, admiration for Rebecca Walker's foresight overwhelming him. She created a key that only works here, in this specific place. The projected map showed the entire cave system in detail, the multiple water sources, the chambers containing ancestral treasures, and most importantly, additional passages leading to hidden exits around the mountain. Escape routes, Elena realized, studying the projection. If one entrance is discovered, others remain. The sound of dislodged stones from the passage behind them shattered the moment. Tarak instantly moved to a defensive position, knife drawn, while Mason extinguished the lantern to preserve their night vision. Someone's coming, he whispered, drawing his pistol. Get behind me. Elena positioned herself protectively near Sarah, her own weapon, the old cavalry rifle, raised and ready. They waited in tense silence as the sounds grew closer. Multiple people approaching with little attempt at stealth. The first figure to emerge into the chamber was Blackwood, a lantern held high in one hand, a pistol in the other. Behind him came Hayes, still in his sheriff's disguise, and two of the Indian hunters they'd glimpsed earlier. Well, well, Blackwood's voice echoed in the chamber, his expression triumphant as his lantern light fell upon the small group. Seems we found a nest of conspirators. Dr. Reed, harboring Apache fugitives. His gaze shifted to Elena, and not just any Apache, a survivor from Black Mountain. How touching. Hayes stepped forward, his attention fixed not on the adults but on Sarah. Something passed across his weathered face, a complex emotion that might have been recognition, might have been regret. The child, he said quietly. Rebecca's daughter. Sarah stared back at him without fear, her small hand clutching the cross at her neck. You killed my mother's people, she said with the direct simplicity of childhood. She wrote about you, not good things. Hayes flinched as if struck, but recovered quickly. You don't understand, child. I've been searching for you for years. You belong with your own kind. She is with her kind, Elena retorted, her rifle steady despite the odds against them. Rebecca chose our people over yours. Sarah is Apache in her heart. Enough of this family reunion, Blackwood cut in impatiently. Hayes, we had an agreement. The golden water rights in exchange for my help finding the map. He gestured around the chamber. Seems we've found both. Time to conclude our business. Mason kept his pistol trained on Blackwood, mind racing through limited options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered in an unfamiliar cave system. Even if they could somehow overpower these four, more would be waiting outside. There doesn't need to be more bloodshed, Mason said, trying to buy time. The caves have enough water for everyone. As for the gold, it's cultural heritage, not currency. Taking it would be theft, not treasure hunting. Blackwood laughed coldly. Always the idealist, Reed. This isn't about sharing resources. This is about control. Whoever controls water in a drought controls everything. His gaze hardened. Put down your weapons, or we start shooting, beginning with the boy. One of the Indian hunters leveled his rifle at Tarak, who remained poised to attack despite the futility of his knife against firearms. The moment balanced on a knife edge of tension, each side measuring the other's resolve. It was Hayes who broke the impasse, though not in the way anyone expected. No, he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. No more killing. He lowered his weapon slightly. I didn't come back to bury another generation. Blackwood turned to him in disbelief. Gone soft, Colonel? After everything we did to find this place? I came for my granddaughter, Hayes replied, his gaze never leaving Sarah. And for what Rebecca left behind. Not for more graves. He addressed Mason directly now. Dr. Reed, I remember you from Black Mountain. You questioned the operation, tried to prevent what happened. Mason nodded cautiously, uncertain where this was leading. I failed. Perhaps we both did. Hayes gestured towards Sarah. Rebecca was headstrong, brilliant but impossible to control. When she fell in love with that Apache warrior, I thought she was just rebelling. By the time I understood it was genuine, things had escalated. You ordered the massacre, Elena accused, her voice tight with controlled fury. You can't rewrite that history now. No, I can't, Hayes acknowledged, surprising them all with his candor. But I can choose a different path today. He turned to Blackwood. Our arrangement is terminated. These caves and their contents belong to the child and her people. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. You senile old fool. You think you can back out now? His gun swung toward Hayes. I didn't spend years playing along with your obsession just to walk away empty-handed. The revelation hung in the air. Blackwood had been using Hayes all along, exploiting his search for his granddaughter and the lost map to further his own ambitions. The precarious alliance between them shattered like glass. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic speed of all true violence. Blackwood fired at Hayes, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Hayes staggered but remained upright, returning fire even as he fell to one knee. The Indian hunters, seeing their employer wounded, opened fire on Mason and Elena. Mason pushed Sarah toward a rock outcropping for shelter, firing back as Elena and Tarak sought cover behind a stalagmite formation. The chamber filled with gun smoke and echoing reports as bullets ricocheted off stone surfaces. Through the chaos, Mason glimpsed Sarah crawling toward the central pool where sunlight still streamed from above. Following her mother's instructions, perhaps, where the sun and water meet. Whatever her intention, the movement drew Blackwood's attention. The cross, he shouted, recognizing its significance. Get the cross from her. One of the Indian hunters broke from cover, rushing towards Sarah with outstretched hands. Mason fired, catching the man in the shoulder, but not before he reached the child. Sarah screamed as the hunter grabbed for the silver chain around her neck. Then something unexpected happened. Tarak launched himself from hiding, his knife flashing in the dim light. The blade found its mark in the hunter's back, driving deep with all the strength of the boy's pent-up rage. The man collapsed, releasing Sarah, who scrambled away toward the pool. The momentary distraction gave Elena a clear shot at the second hunter. She took it without hesitation, her rifle barking once. The man fell, clutching his leg and dropping his weapon. Blackwood, seeing his advantage evaporating, fired wildly toward Mason's position. A bullet grazed Mason's arm, sending a hot line of pain across his flesh, but he maintained his focus, returning fire with careful precision. Hayes, meanwhile, had dragged himself behind a rock formation, blood seeping from a wound in his side. "Sarah," he called, his voice strained but carrying. "I never knew about you until after everything. Your mother hid you well." The child paused at the edge of the pool, the cross still clutched in her small hand. "You hurt my people," she replied, her voice somehow cutting through the gunfire and echoing in the chamber. "I did," Hayes admitted, wincing with pain. "And I've lived with that knowledge every day since. I came back to make amends in whatever way I could." He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Rebecca would have wanted you to live, to carry on what she began here." Blackwood used the distraction to change position, moving towards Sarah with murderous intent. Mason saw the movement and fired, his bullet striking Blackwood's arm. The rancher cursed but didn't slow, lunging toward the child with his good arm outstretched. Sarah, showing presence of mind beyond her years, stepped into the pool itself, the water rising to her waist. Blackwood hesitated at the edge, unwilling to pursue her into the water with his wounds. Instead, he aimed his pistol directly at her. "Give me the cross," he demanded, "or I'll make sure you join your mother and father." "No," Hayes shouted, rising from his cover despite his injury. He fired at Blackwood, the shot going wide but forcing the rancher to turn. The distraction was enough. Mason rushed Blackwood from behind, tackling him into the pool. They struggled in the waist-deep water, each fighting for control of Blackwood's pistol. Mason's wounds hampered him, but desperation lent him strength. He managed to force Blackwood's hand upward just as the rancher pulled the trigger. The shot struck the cave ceiling, dislodging fragments of rock that rained down around them. Elena waded into the pool, pulling Sarah to safety while Mason continued to grapple with Blackwood. The rancher fought with the frenzy of a cornered predator, landing a solid blow to Mason's injured arm that sent waves of pain through his body. "Enough!" Hayes's voice thundered through the chamber. He stood at the pool's edge, his pistol aimed at Blackwood's head with unwavering steadiness despite his wounds. "It's over, Clayton. Let him go." Blackwood sneered, still struggling against Mason's grip. "You won't shoot me, James. We've come too far together." "Black Mountain taught me the cost of hesitation," Hayes replied coldly. "I won't make that mistake again." Something in his tone convinced Blackwood of his seriousness. The rancher slowly released his hold on Mason, raising his hands in surrender. Mason backed away, retrieving Blackwood's fallen weapon from the water. As they all regained their footing on dry ground, the tableau held a fragile stillness. Hayes and Blackwood wounded but alive. One Indian hunter dead, the other incapacitated. Tarak stood guard over the surviving hunter, his knife still bloody. Elena held Sarah close, whispering reassurances in Apache. And Mason, dripping water and blood, positioned himself between these factions, uncertain how this standoff would resolve. Hayes broke the silence, addressing his granddaughter directly. "Sarah, I can't undo what happened to your parents or your people, but I can ensure you inherit what's rightfully yours." He gestured to the chamber around them. "This place, its waters, its treasures, all of it." "Pretty words from a dying man," Blackwood spat. "The territory will never recognize Apache claims, especially from a half-breed child." "They'll recognize mine," Hayes countered. "I've spent the past 5 years securing legal rights to this entire mountain, under my real name, not Daniel's. It's all documented in Carson City." He looked at Sarah again. "And I've already filed papers naming you as my sole heir." The revelation stunned everyone. Hayes had been playing a longer game than any of them realized, not just seeking the caves or his granddaughter, but legally securing their future. "Why?" Elena asked, suspicion evident in her tone. "Why protect what you once tried to destroy?" Hayes's weathered face showed the full weight of his regrets. "Because Rebecca was right, about everything, about the Apache way, about the water, about what this land needs to survive." He coughed again, more blood appearing at his lips. "I was blinded by ambition, by what I thought progress meant." She saw clearer. Mason moved to examine Hayes's wound, his doctor's instincts overriding past grievances. The injury was severe. The bullet had penetrated the abdominal cavity, causing internal bleeding that no frontier medicine could repair. "You need to get to town," Mason said, though they both knew it was futile. Hayes shook his head. Too late for that, but not too late for this. He reached inside his coat with trembling fingers, extracting folded papers sealed with the official stamps. Deeds, ownership transfers, all legal and binding. The mountain, the water rights, everything. Transferred to Sarah Walker Hayes. He held them out to Elena. "Keep these safe for her. Teach her both ways, Apache wisdom and white man's law. She'll need both to protect this place." Elena hesitated, then accepted the documents with the gravity they deserved. She will know her heritage, all of it, the good and the bad, the heroes and the villains. Her gaze held his steadily, and which were which? Hayes nodded, accepting the judgment implicit in her words. "Fair enough." He turned to Mason. "Read, there are men outside. My men, not Blackwood's. Tell them Daniels is dead, and Hayes has returned to make things right." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "They have new orders now, to protect this mountain and those who belong to it." Mason recognized the military phrasing, the chain of command Hayes was establishing even in his final moments. "I'll tell them," he promised. Hayes's attention returned to Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with solemn attention. "Child," he said softly, "I would have liked to know you, to hear you laugh perhaps, to see Rebecca in your smile." His voice grew fainter. "Will you come closer? Just once?" Sarah looked to Elena, who nodded permission after a moment's hesitation. The girl approached her grandfather cautiously, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "You have her eyes," Hayes murmured. "Her spirit too, I think." He didn't try to touch her, respecting the distance she maintained. "The cross, keep it safe. It's more than a map now. It's your history, your inheritance." Sarah nodded, her young face composed despite the drama unfolding around her. "I will," she promised. Then, with wisdom beyond her years, she added, "Rest now, Mother will find you on the other side." Hayes closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. "That would be more than I deserve." His breathing grew labored, each inhale a visible struggle. "Read," he managed, eyes still closed. "The water sings. Listen to it. It will tell you what to do." They were his final words. James Hayes, once colonel, then sheriff, finally just a grandfather, drew one last shuddering breath and was still. The cave fell silent except for the gentle music of flowing water. The singing rivers of Sarah's dream, which would now sustain her people because of choices made in these final moments. Blackwood, watching from where Mason had bound him to a stalagmite, laughed bitterly. "Touching deathbed redemption," he sneered. "But my men are still out there, and they won't recognize Hayes's authority or his paperwork." "Perhaps not," Mason acknowledged, checking his pistol. "But they'll recognize superior numbers and position." He turned to Elena. "Stay here with Sarah and Tarak. Guard him." He nodded toward Blackwood. "I'll speak to Hayes's men." "Be careful," Elena warned. "Trust, but verify." Mason made his way back through the cave passages, emerging into the harsh sunlight of midday. As Hayes had indicated, several men in quasi-military gear were positioned around the cave entrance, alert but not aggressive. They tensed as Mason appeared, hands moving to weapons. "Sheriff Daniels is dead," Mason announced, using the name they would recognize. Before he died, he revealed himself as Colonel Hayes and gave new orders. He held their gaze steadily. This mountain and its caves are now the legal property of his granddaughter, Sarah Walker Hayes. The colonel's final order was to protect this place and those who belong to it. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty evident in their postures. The oldest among them, a grizzled veteran with sergeant's stripes still visible on his faded cavalry jacket, stepped forward. "Hayes was a good commander," he said slowly. "Never left his men behind, never gave an order he wouldn't follow himself." He studied Mason carefully. "These new orders, they include protecting Apache?" Mason nodded, not backing down. "The girl is half Apache. Her mother chose their ways. Hayes's final act was to honor that choice." The old sergeant seemed to reach a decision. "Then we'll honor it too." He gestured to his men. "Secure the perimeter. No one approaches without authorization." He turned back to Mason. "What about Blackwood? His hunters?" "Blackwood is wounded but alive. One hunter dead, one injured." Mason didn't soften the reality. They opposed Hayes's final orders. The sergeant nodded grimly. We'll handle Blackwood. Take him to face territorial justice for conspiracy and attempted murder. He extended a hand to Mason. John Phillips, formerly 7th Cavalry. Now I suppose we're... He glanced at the mountain rising above them. Guardians of a watershed. Mason shook the offered hand, relief coursing through him. The immediate danger had passed, though challenges certainly lay ahead. There are others, he explained, a small group of Apache survivors, including Hayes's granddaughter. They've been hiding in the desert, hunted by Blackwood's men. Bring them here, Phillips decided. Safer than anywhere else now. Hayes's name still carries weight with the authorities. A hint of irony touched his voice, especially now that he's dead and can't change his mind. By nightfall, Naya, Lena, and young Kai had been safely brought to the caves. Blackwood and his wounded hunter had been taken to town under guard, their fate now in the hands of territorial justice. Hayes had been buried on the mountain, as he had requested in his final moments. Not in the Apache tradition, but not entirely separate from it either. A man between worlds, much like his granddaughter. Mason stood at the entrance to the main cave, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. His wounds had been tended by Elena, whose knowledge of healing plants complemented his medical training. They had worked well together, just as they had in every challenge since their paths recrossed. Elena joined him now, her presence a quiet comfort as they contemplated the vast desert spread below the mountain. In the valley, Mason's small ranch was just visible, a tiny outpost of his former life, now seeming distant in more ways than geography. What will you do now? Elena asked, her voice soft in the evening stillness. Mason considered the question carefully. I'm not sure my cabin feels like home anymore, he admitted. Too empty, too quiet. The caves have room, she offered, her tone carefully neutral. Sarah has taken a liking to you, and your medical skills would benefit our people. The invitation hung in the air between them, not just a practical arrangement, but something deeper, something neither was quite ready to name. I'd need to bring my harmonica, Mason said finally, a smile touching his lips. Promise to teach Sarah to play. Elena's answering smile carried the warmth of possibility. I think that could be arranged. From inside the cave came the sound of children's laughter. Sarah showing Kai something in the underground pool, their voices echoing with the unself-conscious joy of youth. The sound represented everything they had fought for, everything that mattered. Black Mountain, Mason mused, gazing at the dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. Strange how a place of death could become a sanctuary of life. Perhaps that's how healing works, Elena suggested, building something new from the broken pieces of the past. She touched the silver cross now hanging around her neck. Sarah had insisted she wear it for safekeeping. Rebecca understood that. She planted seeds she would never see grow. As they stood together on the threshold between the ancient cave and the endless desert sky, Mason felt something he had not experienced in 7 long years, a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond mere survival. The burden he had carried since Black Mountain hadn't disappeared, but somehow it had transformed, becoming the foundation for something new rather than a weight dragging him into darkness. The water sings, he said softly, echoing Hayes's final words. Listen to it, it will tell you what to do. And indeed, if one listened carefully, the gentle music of the underground springs seemed to whisper of renewal, of cycles continuing, of life persisting, despite everything aligned against it. Like the desert itself, which appeared barren until the rare rains came, revealing seeds that had waited patiently for their moment to flourish. As night fully claimed the mountain, Mason and Elena returned to the cave where their unlikely family gathered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles perhaps, certainly adjustments, as two cultures learned to coexist in this sacred space. But tonight, in the soft glow of firelight, reflected off ancient cave walls, surrounded by the gentle music of water that had flowed since before human memory, there was only this moment of hard-won peace. The turquoise strand Elena had given Mason now hung beside the entrance, catching firelight as they passed beneath it, no longer a warning but a promise, a symbol of boundaries crossed and new beginnings forged from the ashes of the past. Redemption, Mason reflected as he joined the circle around the fire, didn't erase what came before. But perhaps it transformed it into something that could, at last, nourish rather than haunt the soul. As the evening deepened, Lena began to tell a story, speaking more words at once than Mason had heard from her before. Her voice, rich with the cadence of oral tradition, drew everyone into a circle as she recounted an ancient Apache tale of waters hidden beneath the desert, waiting for those worthy enough to find them. Sarah translated quietly for Mason, though he found himself understanding more Apache words than he'd realized he knew. The language once alien to him had begun to take shape in his mind, another boundary slowly dissolving. She says Black Mountain was known to our ancestors as the sleeping guardian, Sarah whispered. The mountain kept secrets, waiting for the right time to reveal them. When Lena finished, Tarek unexpectedly produced a small wooden flute from his pack. The instrument looked hand-carved, perhaps made during their time in hiding. He offered it to Mason with a slight nod. He wants you to play with him, Elena explained, surprise evident in her voice. It's an honor. Music was sacred to his father's family. Mason hesitated, then retrieved his harmonica. I'm not sure I know any Apache songs. Then play what you feel, Nea suggested. Her normally practical voice softened. The mountain will understand. Mason began a simple melody, the notes hanging in the cave's perfect acoustics. After a few measures, Tarak joined in, the flute's clear tone weaving around the harmonica's earthier sound. They had never played together, never practiced, yet somehow the music found its harmony. Two traditions speaking a common language. As the impromptu duet echoed through the ancient chambers, Mason caught Elena's gaze across the fire. There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude or respect, or even the cautious friendship that had grown between them. It was possibility, a future unwritten. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall on the parched desert, rare and precious, just like the moment they shared. The water would seep into the ground, finding hidden channels, nourishing roots that had waited patiently through the long drought. By morning, wildflowers might appear where yesterday there had been only dust. Some transformations were visible, Mason thought. Others happened beneath the surface in the quiet places where wounds became scars and scars became stories, and stories became songs. And sometimes, if you were fortunate, those songs found their way back to you, changed but recognizable, like an echo returning from a distant canyon wall. The last notes faded into silence, but their resonance remained. In the air, in the stone, in the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. Tomorrow would come with its challenges, but tonight in this place once marked by death, life had found its footing once more. And that, Mason knew, was enough, more than enough. It was everything.